Hello, and welcome to episode 6 of African Battle Royale. Let's get right into it. South Africa will be invading Northeast. So you remember how South Africa had a whole democratic revolution and stuff? It didn't last for long. The rebels who were in charge of the democratic revolution didn't really want to give up power, and so they just didn't. And so South Africa will begin their invasion of Lesotho. And unfortunately for Lesotho, despite the land they gained, they are not going to be able to stand up to South Africa by themselves, as the new South African dictatorship starts their invasion of Lesotho. Fortunately, they will be getting some allies to help them. First of all, obviously, Eswatini is going to help them, followed by Botswana and Namibia, who shouldn't have been filled in at the same time. So South Africa's gains are going to continue into Lesotho, but not for long, because they are their new capital, by the way, is Cape Town. They had 3, but now they only have 1. And Cape Town is getting approached very rapidly by Namibian and Botswanan forces. So South Africa is kind of afraid of that and will withdraw some troops from Lesotho, not too many, but some, to start dealing with that. And it goes well because South Africa is actually fairly strong, and this time Zimbabwe is staying out of it, and South Africa is trying to get Zimbabwe to actually join their side of this war, which might happen, but this is a smaller coalition than it was last time, and therefore the war is a lot more balanced. You have to remember, Namibia basically owns just a giant desert. So Lesotho is actually still losing land, even as South Africa is continuing to fight back in the west. And Eswatini starts getting invaded into, and pretty much decides to pull out of the war the second they even get close to being threatened. Which leads to South Africa fully withdrawing from them, because that was part of the conditions under which they left the war. And Lesotho is just getting completely destroyed, with only a little bit of their country left, but they're deciding to hold out in hopes that their allies will win the war for them. And luckily for them, things are going pretty well for their allies right now, as South Africa is... However, South Africa decides to stick to this front, cutting off parts of Lesotho from the rest, and Zimbabwe is deciding to stay neutral this time, and Lesotho will lose almost all of their territory before actually losing all of their territory. However, the Allies have just gotten extremely close to Cape Town, which is very worrying for South Africa. And a naval landing is made over here that South Africa just wasn't even aware that was happening. But Namibia will land some troops over here. South Africa will pretty quickly repel this naval landing, but it's kind of a back and forth war, and it's taking a while for it to be settled, so let's actually do another event. Guinea-Bissau will be invading Southeast. This is an interesting turn of events. Guinea-Bissau is trying to invade into Guinea, and they move some troops in. And then Guinea obviously occupies all of Guinea-Bissau and basically uses their whole army on this, and obviously it's mostly intact. Of course, then the Tan Alliance decides to show what they actually were trying to do, which was get rid of Guinea, and so Guinea-Bissau is basically just their way of distracting the Guinean military and moving them out of this area, which they did, because Guinea wasn't that good at warfare. At this point, their former ally, Sierra Liberia, will also betray Guinea, and at this point, Guinea is just not doing very well. Rwanda is doing their best to send forces to help out their ally, which is working, and Guinea will have to surrender. And in this peace treaty, Senegal actually gave up some of the land they had taken from Mali in the previous episode in exchange for, and also gave some of Guinea-Bissau their old land back in order to get a lot of land from Guinea, which they did. Sierra Liberia also obviously gets some of the land. Let's look back at the South African War, which is continuing to rage on. Neither side is really budging. South Africa makes some minor strides over here, but their forces have been fully pushed out of Botswana, so it's kind of just like not really anything is changing. South Africa tries again to invade into Botswana, and this time basically starts conscripting soldiers, which is doing really well at letting them push back. But another South African rebellion is happening. this time in the southernmost part of the country, and this might be the exact place where the naval landings happened, because maybe those weren't just soldiers who landed there, maybe they were propagandists, and maybe they were South African people in exile who got cold by the current government, and so maybe a giant South African rebellion is happening here. Following that, Eswatini decides to join back in on the conflict, beginning to liberate Lesotho, because they believe that South Africa is going to lose, and South Africa is trying to repel this rebellion as well, but in doing so they lose a lot of their basically the edge they had in the entire front of the war, the northern front specifically, where they are just losing catastrophically in order to get rid of this rebellion. They get rid of the rebellion pretty successfully in that it's completely gone, but Lesotho is now being freed, and it might be reported that Zimbabwe is helping out the anti-South African forces now, as obviously these South African forces aren't able to do anything. And right as they get to the area where the rebellion was previously situated, the rebellion is sponsored to appear once again just to ensure South Africa's demise. And at this point, Cape Town is captured, and the rebels are given control of the rest of South Africa. So let's see how this works out. And these are the new borders of Southern Africa. The South African rebellion wasn't given that much land, so that even if they don't become democratic, they can't actually realistically fight back anymore. Cameroon will be invading east. But of course, this isn't just Cameroon. Cameroon will be the first to send troops into the CAR, but they won't be the last, as pretty quickly after this, Sudan will also send their troops in. And Sudan is not just sending in Sudanese troops, no. They're also sending in Ugandan troops, Tanzanian troops, and Somalia troops. And the CAR is very strong, so they will be able to mostly repel these invasions at first, keeping the front lines like this, and they will have a counter-invasion where they start invading into Sudan. And it's looking like things are not going to go well for the Dark Blue Alliance, or at least not as well as they thought things were going to go. But with all of their allies sending troops in, Sudan is able to start pushing back, and especially in the south, they basically slowly but surely push the CAR all the way to their border, leaving a small number of troops here, which will then be taken by Rwanda. And Rwanda is not really allied with the Dark Blue Alliance, but they just wanted the land, and Sudan let it happen because it is an easy way to get rid of them. Zimbabwe will now officially join in on the war, moving troops into the south of Tanzania. Tanzania expected this to happen, but they just didn't prepare well enough for it to happen. And to respond to this event, Tanzania, who was basically the main one who was sending troops all the way to Cameroon, will cease doing so. And in that, Cameroon will, let's just say they will not be faring well, as they are reduced to a small amount of land around their coast, while Sudan is also starting to get pushed back, and Rwanda is refusing to help them. Tanzania, however, by basically using the armies that were already trained and mobilized and stuff, will be able to start invading into Zimbabwe. However, Zimbabwe is able to get some other countries to help them out. Eswatini will help them out. Lesotho will help them out. Botswana will help them out. And I know that technically these guys should be light blue because the Dark Blue Alliance were the aggressors, but it'll be way better just for visually if it's the other way around. So, with the entrance of these three countries into the war, the tides change once again. Namibia stays suspiciously quiet, but Tanzania and Somalia, who's attached to Tanzania, will start losing their grip on their country as they get pushed all the way halfway into Tanzania. Cameroon will lose whatever hope they had left and will give up and hope their allies will save them. Togo is just over here chilling, basically. But fortunately, the tide will change again as Sudan makes a massive genius battle that basically wipes out a large portion of the CAR's military, and it allows for them to get into the desert where there's a lot of battles being fought in the desert, because although the desert shouldn't be that important, it's the only way for the CAR, first of all, to help out Zimbabwe because they need to get to their coast and also just to get to their northern territories. And so a lot of battles are fought in the desert, and Sudan is consistently winning them. And eventually, the desert is occupied by Sudanese forces. And because of that, these northern forces are kind of isolated. And they're going to have to deal with another thing that's happening, which is a Libyan rebellion happening in the north of the country. And so these brown troops will be sent to deal with that, which will allow for Sudanese troops to start taking the rest of the desert. And eventually, the rebellion will actually win because there's not really any more troops being sent here. So Libya might become a country again. However, it's not over yet for the Brown Alliance. First of all, they're still somehow winning in Tanzania despite being significantly weaker. And second of all, they just got Egypt to join their side. So Egypt will invade west into the Libyan rebel territory before taking a lot of the desert that wasn't really defended because it's desert. Sudan was spending this time pushing down towards the CAR part of the Chad African Republic, but it is of no use. Togo finally sends in troops to help out with Cameroon, and it looks like things are going to get pretty dicey. Egypt starts moving troops into Sudan, which means that Tanzania and Somalia have to make a decision of help ourselves or help out Sudan, and they decide to help themselves. And they officially basically stop helping their alliance. In doing so, they are able to very much push back Zimbabwe into their own territory before it gets all the way to here when this front line is small enough that these four countries can handle it. However, it also means that Sudan is probably not long for this world, as they are getting pushed back against by the CAR, who has fully taken most of their territory back. Rwanda has taken the liberty of taking some of this territory, and the CAR lets them because they are more mad at Sudan than they are at Rwanda. And if things weren't bad enough for the Dark Blue Alliance, Ethiopia will join the coalition against them and start invading into Somalia. However, Uganda will start invading into them, and Rwanda will actually be sending troops into Uganda to help invade into Ethiopia. With this front line being so small, Tanzania doesn't need that many troops here, and instead they decide to focus their troops up against Ethiopia, and Ethiopia is not just straight up didn't expect to be losing this badly this quickly. Egypt just connected up their land with Ethiopia, and Sudan is basically fully falling at this point. Like, they don't really have a country anymore, and so they just can kind of go bye-bye, and Rwanda is pressured into withdrawing from the CAR and basically leaving the war. However, a massive new event just occurred right as this happened, and that massive new event is that Egypt is refusing to withdraw their troops from the CAR's northern territories. And with this, Egypt and the CAR are no longer allied to each other, and the red and brown sections of the alliance, at least in the north, are not allied. Egypt and Ethiopia are allied, and now this is kind of a three faction war. And to make it easier to visualize that, I'm going to color these countries in brown just so you can tell these countries are still on the brown side of it. And in fact, they are starting to gain back a lot of Zimbabwe's former territory. But the CAR will start pushing into Egypt's territory over here, and they will officially take back their Libyan coast as well as push into the western parts of Egypt, while Egypt and Ethiopia will make an effort over here to push against the CAR's occupying forces. Rwanda will join as a fourth side, invading into here. They're sort of aligned with the blue faction, but not fully. Sudan will continue invading into Egypt, and Egypt is not actually winning. And I said Sudan, I meant the CAR. Cameroon will once again have troops landed here, as well as just face uprisings from the people. And the CAR will not be very good at dealing with this because they're fighting a two-front war right now. And they're losing the eastern front because Egypt is just doing really well as they retake the Libyan coastline. And with that, about half of their northern territories just fall pretty quickly. Ethiopia is not exactly doing well, though, because the Blue Alliance is also managing to invade into them. And Egypt and Ethiopia will look at each other and basically Ethiopia will finally leave the war. So Egypt is now the only one on the red side of this three-way war. Given that they're not really fighting with the blue side anymore, it's kind of just a two-sided war, with the Brown Alliance on the losing side and the red and Egypt, as well as the dark blue alliance on the winning side. As the CAR is getting squeezed out, Rwanda continues the invading, as well as taking some former Sudanese land. Sudan will be invaded and retaken, which means Egypt is now again fighting the Blue Alliance, because the Blue Alliance is trying to reestablish a Sudanese government, which they succeed in doing. The CAR has fully been destroyed, and Egypt will take any land they were occupying. And now there's still three sides, because there's also Zimbabwe, but now it's kind of everyone against the Blue Alliance, which before it was pretty recently everyone against the Brown Alliance, but that's okay because the Brown Alliance is kind of screwed as these guys redirect their forces south and basically split their forces in two after making a deal with Ethiopia to stop occupying them. In exchange for a bit of land, they stopped occupying Ethiopia, which basically means that all of their former occupying forces can now be sent straight into Zimbabwe, who is really suffering. And in their moment of need, Zimbabwe's three allies will say, actually, we're out. And Zimbabwe will have to fight on their own. They're doing okay for a little while. But then in the north, massive gains are made by the Blue Alliance against Egypt. And Egypt is currently doing pretty well. So they sit down for peace negotiations with the Blue Alliance, which means that the Northern War is basically done. And with that, Zimbabwe is cooked. And these three countries look at each other, and at the very last minute, they decide that they are going to divide the rest of Zimbabwe up between them, and they join the war and take the rest of Zimbabwe so they can get some land out of it. And we're going to be looking at the entire map of Africa to discuss this peace treaty, because this was a very continent-wide war. So first of all, the CAR still exists, but they were given a new government that's aligned with the Peace Alliance. Zimbabwe, Tanzania was basically adamant that it was completely destroyed, but they also didn't want to take too much land because this was a very defensible border. So they gave these three countries more land than even these three countries wanted in order to keep a defensible border and also not take too much land. Sudan was brought back, and to compensate Egypt, they got all of this western land, and then Rwanda also gets a bunch of land. Equatorial Guinea will be making an alliance with Gabon. So these two countries are sandwiched between the Peace Alliance, which is not actually for peace anymore, because obviously they just started a massive war that they won, in which they annexed a bunch of land, and the Congo, who is very aggressive. So obviously they're going to want to team up. And they're going to form the Berry Alliance, because that's the color I would call this. Namibia will be invading northwest. Speaking of the Congo, they have been threatening Namibia for a while, saying basically join our empire or else, and Namibia's sick of it. So Namibia is going to invade. And Namibia's invasion starts off going well enough, but the Congo is very strong, and Namibia is going to suffer, at least at first, before any allies join them, because allies will join them. The first countries to join them are the brand new Berry Alliance, who wants to kind of, first of all, show their strength, and second of all, weaken the Congo. And so they're doing that, and it's going fairly well for them. But the Congo is able to fight back, and they kind of crush Gabon, like they previously did. Namibia, on the other hand, is holding their own. So although Congo is making some small gains, it's nothing major. Congo will then get the new South African government, which is actually a democracy, but it kind of doesn't really like the countries that keep invading it. So South Africa will retake Cape Town, which the current elected person has been campaigning on, and they'll start invading into the South African territories of Namibia. But this will get even more allies to join Namibia's side, specifically Botswana, Lesotho, and Eswatini, because they are afraid of South Africa. And they will all send their troops into the new South African Republic. and South Africa will not be able to hold much for very long under the system as they get completely overrun, and it's agreed by everyone that South Africa will no longer exist as a country. And now things are going to get even worse for the Congo as Namibia starts invading into them and gets into their territory. And at this point, Congo basically, they're very worried. They go to everyone and basically like, can anyone negotiate a peace deal before things get ugly for us? And Zambia offers to do it, and the Red Alliance, the Berry Alliance agrees to it, but the Red Alliance rejects it, and so the Berry Alliance is actually just left alone, and all land is re-exchanged, and they're out of the war. But now Zambia will actually join Congo, and this is very bad for them or bad for the Red Alliance, good for Congo, as they pretty quickly managed to cut off this small piece of land and take it. Some troops do manage to escape back to Eswatini, but the Red Alliance is now on the back foot as South African rebels pop up over here, as well as in Cape Town, and meet up. And the Red Alliance sees what's happening, and they finally do agree to a peace. So let's see what happens. And these guys really want a bunch of land, and so they're willing to give up on South Africa's existence in order to take it, and so that is why. This is what the peace treaty looks like. Ghana will be invading north. Ghana really doesn't like the existence of the Dark Blue Alliance right on their border, and they're going to do something about it. As they start invading into Togo, and Togo being the very weak country that it is not able to hold up, their actual territory is taken and the entire country will surrender. And it looks like that might be that. But then, some troops from Cameroon, that are also from the rest of the Dark Blue Alliance, land in the southern coast of Ghana. And Ghana realizes they might have committed a massive oopsie, as Togo starts being liberated and the massive coalition of forces is able to just wipe out Ghana just like that. Let's see what the division of Ghana looks like. And just like that, Ghana was wiped off the map. But with that, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, all that good stuff. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.